This is a true story that I hope many of you can relate to. My story is based on a lifetime of love, betrayal, redemption, and finally acceptance and appreciation. I also hope that what I have learned in my life may also be of value and interest to other people in a similar situation. I was born in 1951, am now 73 years old, and my childhood was very sad and bitter. Unfortunately, I never knew my mother or father. Apparently, my mother was a woman with terrible substance abuse problems, and there was no background or history of my father. Any additional family was non-existent, and the state took me into custody when I was less than 1 year old. From the little history that I know, I was left alone in a dirty and trash-strewn apartment all by myself. The landlord had heard me crying for almost 24 hours and notified the local authorities, who then came and got me. Nobody ever came looking for me. To this day, I am not sure why I was not adopted, since there was always a demand for babies for adoption. It appeared the issue was that the state continued to search for my family, but nobody could be located. We talk about slipping through the cracks and being lost in the system. I believe that is essentially what happened to me. I was shuttled from foster home to foster home and then finally to an orphanage. Every time it looked like a family would take me in, the state stepped in and sent me to a different home or facility. I had no stability or security, and never knew where I would end up. At a certain point of my life, I was viewed as too old for adoption, and eventually lived in an orphanage in a northwestern suburb of Chicago run by the Catholic Charities. Anybody who lives in the Chicago area will know this place, as it has been around for over 100 years. Now, don't get me wrong. I was never abused or neglected and was well taken care of. The problem, of course, is that living in an orphanage with no real family results in a sense of loss, not belonging, and being forgotten. Meal times were always interesting for me. I never starved, but of course never felt full either. Institutional meals are not the epitome of culinary excellence, and a person can only eat overcooked meatloaf so many times. Breakfast always consisted of cream of wheat, cereal, and toast. As I said, I never starved, but never got quite enough either. I now refuse to eat meatloaf or cream of wheat. Being a ward of the state and living in this type of environment can result in the resident me having to stand up for myself and not being afraid to use my fists. I noted earlier that I was not abused, but that does not mean that I did not have to fight at times to protect myself and my property from other kids. Being able to defend myself became a strength for me during my lifetime. By that I mean more than just being able to fight. Having the mental toughness to deal with this kind of situation, over many years, did give me a type of mental toughness that most young people do not develop. I did not know my parents, but they must have been tall people. It was a benefit to me that I was not vertically challenged, since I was almost always one of the tallest and biggest kids around my age. I never had bullying tendencies, and did not use my size to threaten the other kids either in school or in the orphanage. I would be lying, though, if I did not admit that having strength and size can be a real advantage while living in an orphanage. I have heard horror stories from some of the smaller kids I lived with that had to deal with bullying challenges that I did not have to face. As noted earlier, my childhood was sad, forlorn, and for the most part loveless. In fact, I do not remember ever being kissed or hugged until I reached my teenage years. The kids from the orphanage attended local schools. I always thought we were looked down upon by the teachers and the other kids from town. For some reason, teachers always spoke slowly and loudly to me, as if I did not have the intellectual ability to learn and apply myself in school. My grades were okay, but I must admit that I was an indifferent student. I blame myself for my mediocre academic performance, but there was no question in my mind that my teachers placed me in the second tier, paid little attention to me, and basically wrote me off. I did have some success in sports, and specifically with football and wrestling. I had good size, strength, and speed. I began playing football and participating in wrestling when I was about 10 years old. It is important for me to note that while the teachers were indifferent to me, my youth coaches were the opposite. And I know it was not just because of my size and athleticism. There were other kids from the orphanage who participated, and for some reason, my youth sports coaches were committed and dedicated to working with all of us. One of my athletic coaches took me to the side one day to ask me what was wrong, since he sensed that I was upset. With tears in my eyes, I told him that today was my 12th birthday, and nobody cared. To my astonishment, later that night, that coach showed up at the facility with his wife, cake, ice cream, and a gift. It was that day I learned that there is some empathy, kindness, and love in this world. It might seem to be a minor story, but that day showed me that some people do care about the welfare of others. My coach and his wife continued to keep track of me and make sure that I was taken care of. I learned many years later that he and his wife had made inquiries about either adopting me or being allowed to be my foster parents. I am not sure why the request was denied, but my gut feeling was that it was due to governmental bureaucracy and just being lost in the system. That being said, I saw them on birthdays and holidays. At times, I was also able to come by their home for dinner with their family. This was always a nice event for me, but could also be somewhat bittersweet, since I saw the kind of family life I would have loved to have, but never had the opportunity. This relationship continued until I was about 15. My former coach received a promotion with his company that required him to move to another state. We eventually lost contact, but I appreciate everything that he and his family did for me. As I moved into my teenage years, I continued to go to school, play sports, and try to live the best life that I could. When I was 15, I got my first job at a local restaurant washing dishes at night. The orphanage leadership allowed me to obtain a job after evaluating the restaurant and getting me a work permit. My first paycheck was $8. With this money, I was excited to buy a pair of pants that actually fit me. Clothing was provided to me by the state and donations to the institution. Choice and style were non-existent, so I wore what was provided to me. As an example, I almost always had to roll up my sleeves up since the shirts were almost always too short. In high school, I continued to play football and wrestle. I was able to more than hold my own and did well in sports. I was not outstanding but played all the time and contributed to the team. We won more than we lost, and it was a positive experience for me. During this time, I continued to work in the restaurant. I took phone orders, helped prepare the food, did cleanup duty, and at times worked the tables. I was also able to get my driver's license after one of the owners taught me how to drive. I learned by driving the restaurant delivery van. The owners did this because they liked me. I was always on time, worked hard, and knew that I was not a thief. At times, they even had me close down the restaurant and lock up when they had to leave early for events. Once I had my driver's license, I also made deliveries via the restaurant's delivery van. That worked out well since the other delivery workers had their own vehicles. I had no way to buy a car and would have had no place to park it, even if I bought a car. The delivery van worked well for me, and sometimes the owners would even let me use it for personal reasons. The restaurant owners treated me well. Ironically, the people I worked with at the restaurant were probably the closest thing to a family that I ever had at the time. Friends were tough to make and maintain at the orphanage, since most of the residents would come and go on a regular basis. I lived a total of 9 years at the orphanage. To this day, believe that I am one of the longest residents they ever had. Several others had the dubious honor of being there longer, but I am certainly included in the list for total years spent at the facility. I did fine, but continued to feel that I was completely on my own. I would have loved to be part of a family, but I never had that opportunity. To this day, this continues to haunt me since I always saw myself as an outcast and misfit. When I was 16, I met a young girl who had also got her first job at the restaurant. Her name was Paula, and came from a large Italian-American family who lived in town. Her father was a truck driver, and her mother was like many women at the time, and stayed at home taking care of her family. And what a family it was. There were 10 kids in that family with 5 girls and 5 boys. Everybody knew the family since one of the kids was in just about every grade at school. The daughters, every one of them, were absolutely beautiful. They were on the shorter side, but had jet black, beautiful hair, incredible eyes, and very voluptuous figures. Without doubt, they were absolutely beautiful girls, and had the attention of just about every young suitor in the area. The issue, of course, is that if you wanted to court one of these girls, you also had to deal with the brothers. Each brother was large, tough, and had no concerns with protecting their sisters. All of the boys in the neighborhood understood that if you wanted to date one of the girls, you would eventually have to fight at least one of the brothers. Paula and I worked together and began to get to know each other. I readily admit that I really liked her and did a lot of fantasizing about her and a potential life together. Now, it is important to note this was strictly fantasy, since Paula had no idea how I felt about her. Still, I continued to fantasize about her in many ways, which also almost always included what I called the biblical one. In my mind, we would have an amazing relationship and could build a family and life together. One day, I was carrying a bucket and mop to clean the floors after the restaurant closed. Paula walked past me in what I saw as a very saucy and tempting way. Her hips were swaying and her attributes were bouncing and standing in a proud and staunch manner. I was not paying attention to anything but her. So, I tripped, fell, and dumped over an entire bucket of water. The result was everybody in the restaurant laughing at me after they checked to make sure that I was not hurt. Embarrassment is the word that best describes my reaction, and my face was probably redder than the tablecloths in the dining area. Paula asked me what happened, and I murmured some half-baked excuse about being distracted and not paying attention. She smirked at me and asked, "So, what did you find so distracting?" She knew exactly what had happened, and made a comment that if I paid more attention to my work instead of her, perhaps I would not risk breaking my neck on a nightly basis. I think Paula was trying to entice me to make a move on her, but I was what most of you would call a romantic neophyte. I just had no idea how to try and make a move. I always thought of different approaches, resulting in moments of extreme passion. But I never made a move, so these passionate moments never came to fruition. Luck and fortune were on my side, though, for at least one situation. One night, Paula and I were working at the restaurant and were assigned all the way to closing. To my great fortune, one of her brothers was supposed to pick her up, but had some type of car problem. He called the restaurant and asked if she could get a ride home. One of the owners called me over and told me that after we were done, I would need to drive Paula home with the restaurant van. I would then return the van to the restaurant and leave the keys in the mailbox before walking back home to the orphanage facility. I told Paula that I would drive her home in the van, and in response, she gave me a sexy and saucy smile and nod. Without going into too much detail, it was clear that one part of my body was more than ready to take Paula home and be ready for any activities that might take place. Paula and I were in the van heading home when she asked me, "So, why have you never asked me out?" On hearing this, I almost drove through a red light, had to hit the brakes, and came to a sudden stop. Remember that this was in the 1960s, and nobody wore seatbelts. In fact, I do not think the delivery even had seatbelts. Paula flew out of the passenger seat and basically fell onto my lap. We looked into each other's eyes, and thankfully Paula was apparently tired of my romantic ineptitude. She then reached for me and gave me a hot and passionate kiss. We pulled into the parking lot of the local grocery store and did some serious kissing. My amorous activities were quickly cut short, though, as local law enforcement was driving through the lot and checked out why. There was a solitary van parked at the end of the parking lot. After a short discussion, I was directed to leave the parking lot and get Paula home. To this day, I think the two police officers in the car are still laughing as they busted us and sent us on their way. The relationship between Paula and I quickly moved forward after that night. We were together all the time, and I can truthfully say that I was deeply in love with her. Sometimes things were awkward since I did not have a car and could not take her out on what I would call a traditional date. Her parents were also nice to me, but it was clear they also had some trepidations with me due to my situation. They were not overtly hostile to me, but it was clear they thought my future was doubtful at best. Her brothers were okay with me, but also noted to me that I would be beaten to a pulp if I got out of line or mistreated their sister in any way. Many of the Reddit stories always include tales of hot and romantic bedroom activities. I am chagrined to admit that this was not the case with Paula. First, we had no place to go. Second, I feared her family, and what would happen if they caught me trying to deflower their daughter's sister. Third, I could not even call her on a phone since I had no access to a phone unless I walked about a half-mile to the closest phone booth. Fourth, I did not even own a car, so a backseat conquest was not even a possibility. Lastly, I am embarrassed to admit that I really had no idea what to do and how to protect ourselves from pregnancy. Paula was a very smart girl and made it clear to me there would never be an amorous encounter unless there was a nice private place to take her, and I had appropriate protection. During April 1969, I had just turned 18 and was notified I would have to leave the orphanage after I graduated from high school that June. I had absolutely no idea what I would do or where I would go. My prospects were minimal at best, and I admit that I feared the future. The facility administrators told me that I would not be immediately thrown out on the street with no place to go to, but I needed to start planning for the future. The prom was coming and was held in May of 1969. Paula and I would be going to the prom, and this was the first actual formal dance that I would go to. Of interest is that one of the restaurant owners got me to the side and gave me $20 so I could rent a tuxedo. This was a lot of money at that time, and I greatly appreciated his generosity. But even better is that he let me borrow his Chevy Impala for the dance. His car was mint, and I looked forward to taking Paula to the dance. A week before the prom, Paula took me to the side and told me that we would also go to a party at a large house after the dance. She looked at me and told me that it would be a good idea for me to procure some protection in order for us to move our relationship to the next level. Let me say that I just about ran to a local pharmacy to lay in a supply of protection. Times are different now from 1969. Back then, condoms were kept behind the counter, and you had to specifically ask for them. I will never forget when I went to the counter to make the purchase. The owner of the pharmacy looked at me and asked, "What size?" I was in shock and started to stammer that I did not know. He laughed and told me that he was just making a joke since condoms came in only one size. Before people comment on this, please remember this was 1969. I do not think the idea of magnums had even germinated at this point. He then patted me on the back, sold me several packages of protection, and told me with a smirk, "Have a good time and do not do anything that I would not do." The prom was magical, and the night was even better. Let me say that my first experience was like something you see in a 1980s teenage sexcapade movie. The house was large, and there was a nice guest cottage in the back. We found a room in the cottage and locked the door so we could be alone. The truth is that I could not really figure out what to do. My first performance can probably only be called an exercise in futility. We were maybe 1 minute into our first experience when Paula asked me, "So you are done already? Is that what is supposed to happen?" After this first time, I was more than ready for the next round, and the rest of the night went much better to both of our mutual satisfaction. I got Paula home around 2 a.m. and told her that I loved her. Paula told me she had strong love for me also, and we should talk about the future together. Paula told me she was not a virgin, but had little experience. Let me conclude that I dropped the car off, went back to the orphanage facility, and for the first time in my life, I really felt positive about the future. I graduated from high school in June of 1969, and the orphanage staff told me that I would have to vacate by the end of June. The senior orphanage administrator took me to the side and gave me $100 to get started after I left. That was a lot of money at that time, and I really appreciated it. The school administrators also helped me get a job at a local factory, making $2 per hour, and an apartment over a garage in town. If you ever watched Happy Days and saw Fonzie's apartment over the Cunningham's garage, then you knew what my living style was like. But the apartment was clean and had a bathroom, so I had no complaints. I also bought a 1963 Buick Wildcat. That car was awesome, and I got a great deal on it since the elderly owner had passed away, and the family wanted to get rid of it. To this day, I wish that I still had that car. That car was a beast, and I really loved driving that car. The people that owned the house with the garage apartment were very nice elderly people. The wife told me that no women were allowed in the apartment under any conditions. The husband nodded his agreement when she told me this, but later he got me to the side. With a knowing nod and grin, he told me that what his wife did not know would not hurt her. But if I snuck a girl in, we better be quiet, and she better not be underage. I told him there would be no problems, and there were not any. Along with my car and apartment, I also invested in a plethora of protection to ensure that I could advance my physical relationship with Paula. And advance our relationship we did. In fact, we advanced our relationship just about any time and any place that we could. Paula originally told me she was not interested in backseat romance, but that proved to not be the case. The Buick Wildcat had a large and spacious backseat. Paula had no trepidation with using that backseat to the greatest extent possible. It was July 1969, and I had no complaints about my life. I had a job, an apartment, car, and a very willing girlfriend. I continued to also work at the restaurant on a part-time basis. The money from this part-time job went into a savings account. My goal was to save enough money to propose to Paula and buy her an engagement ring. I had deep love for Paula and dreamed of building a life with her and having a family. The only negative issue was with her family. They liked me but did not see me as having a great future. They thought that Paula should be involved with a man that had much greater prospects. It was a different time, so the thinking of the family was that Paula would become a wife and mother. As I said, her family did not dislike me, but basically thought that Paula could do much better than me. In retrospect, they were probably right, but I always thought that I was up to the challenge of proving them wrong. I just never got that chance. Paula and I talked about our future. She told me that she loved me, but no longer seemed to be quite as committed to me as she was before. She often was no longer available many times in the evenings and told me she was spending more time with her family and friends. She was planning on going to a local junior college and planned to eventually go away to a state school in order to become a teacher. She continued to tell me that she loved me, but I could tell that our passion and commitment was no longer what it originally was. One day, I was at the factory, and one of my coworkers told me that he had seen Paula with a different guy at a local restaurant. This guy knew Paula from the area and was surprised to see her out with this guy. He told me that he did not want to hurt my feelings. However, from their personal interactions, he believed there was a romantic relationship. He wanted me to know for the sake of honesty. I would not say that we were friends since he was quite a bit older than me, but we did work together in a cordial manner. That night I was in my car, and I waited to see where Paula would go. I took the night off from my restaurant part-time job, but she did not know that. Around 7 p.m., she walked out of the house and walked several blocks. A guy in a very nice car picked her up. She got in, and they drove away. I stayed far enough back to not be identified, but did follow their car to a local restaurant. They were in the restaurant for about 90 minutes, and then came out. I was then absolutely shocked when they went to a local hotel. At this time of my life, I could not afford a hotel, and had never even thought of taking Paula to a hotel. It was obvious from the way they walked in together that they were there for only one reason. I was absolutely devastated. All of my thoughts and dreams were immediately destroyed, and I once again felt like a total misfit and outcast. Now, when reviewing this story, please remember what was taking place at this time. The war in Vietnam was literally at the bursting point. The United States had thousands of troops in the country and were actively involved in combat actions against the Viet Cong irregulars and North Vietnamese regular soldiers. The Tet Offensive had taken place in 1968, and the United States was almost tearing itself apart with violent protests. As you read this story, you will see why this is an important consideration. It was obvious to me that my relationship with Paula was over. I got home that night, sat in my apartment, and lamented the future after a rough day with a pizza. The owner of the house came to see me after I got home. He told me that one of the administrators from the orphanage facility had stopped by the house earlier that day to drop off an envelope. A letter had come to my attention at the orphanage. He had a concerned look on his face when he handed me the envelope, and I knew right away what it was. I received a draft notice. My lottery draft number was low, and I was not surprised that I was going to be drafted. I had no money or resources. There was no way I was able to afford college and get a deferment. I knew it was only a matter of time until I got my notice. My first reaction was, so what, because nobody cares about me anyway. I was a nobody, and my death in Vietnam would not cause any concern. My experience with my terminated relationship earlier that night was a great illustration that I had no future, and my death would be of no consequence. The letter indicated a report day for processing and a physical. The letter had been at the orphanage for some time before I received it, and I saw that my physical was scheduled for early the following week. The next day I went to work and showed my boss the notification letter. He was a veteran of World War II and knew what I would be up against. He knew that I would be inducted and almost certainly sent to Vietnam. He shook my hand, told me that I would be paid for the rest of the week, and wished me luck. I knew that I would need luck due to where I was going. Of interesting is that during this time I had no contact with Paula. I'm not sure if she knew that I was aware of the other guy, but I did not see her or have any communication. One night I saw her with the guy in question going into a local theater holding hands. I got a good look at him. Not to sound conceited, but I was much better looking and was in far better shape. He also looked older than me by probably 10 years, and I assumed that he had much better life-related prospects than I did. I did not approach them, and I do not think she saw me. My reaction was, who cares? And I decided that if she wanted him, then she could have him. I'm not saying this situation had no impact on me. I was definitely saddened and upset about it. But I had seen a lot of adversity in my life, and I would not let this get me down. My induction day was interesting. I passed my physical and was told to report in the next 30 days to ship out for basic training. I told the draft administrators about my life situation and asked if there was any way I could ship out earlier. There was nothing going on in my life, so I thought the sooner the better. To my relief, I was told to report back in the next 72 hours, and I would ship out at the end of the week. I had already quit my job and notified the restaurant owners that I was leaving the area. I told them I had been drafted and asked that they not release this information. The owners were all veterans and wished me well. That night I was back in my apartment and felt absolutely pathetic. I packed my personal belongings, and that took less than half of a suitcase. The only personal papers of value that I had were my high school diploma and a birth certificate that listed my father as unknown. When I left the apartment, it would be as if I never existed. Time was short, and I gave my car to my landlord to sell, since I would be leaving with little notice, and he would be out some rent money. He told me that this was not necessary, but I insisted since I did not have the time to sell the car anyway. Being out a couple $100 was not a big deal to me, and I wanted to be fair to my landlord. He agreed to take me to the induction center on my ship-out date and wished me all the best. We did have a conversation about Paula. I doubted if Paula or anybody would come looking for me. But if she did come looking for me, I asked that he please not give her any information about what had happened to me. I intended to completely disappear and have no communication with anybody from the area. I went to basic training and had a very profound experience. I know it sounds strange, but I greatly enjoyed basic training. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of belonging and family. Basic training is very stressful, and I was able to coalesce around some great guys that in my eyes became my brothers. One of the reasons is that many of the guys I went to basic training with also came from poor backgrounds and families. They could not afford to go to college and get deferments, so they were the first drafted. Many years later, I heard a quote from the St. Crispin's Day speech in Shakespeare's play Henry V, and then immortalized in Band of Brothers. This speech absolutely nailed how I felt about the men I served with during my time in the army, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. The only negative aspect of basic training for me is that I never received one single piece of mail, except for some materials sent by the Army. My training instructor one day yelled at me in front of the entire platoon and asked why nobody ever wrote me. He yelled a question if that was because I was a weirdo, complete loser, and nobody in the entire world cared about me. I answered as directed that I was an orphan, raised as a ward of the state, grew up in an orphanage, had nobody, and that I indeed was a misfit that nobody cared about. His eyes flashed with surprise, but then he yelled again that this was a good thing. Then, since the Army would be my family, my tuckus belonged to Uncle Sam. I had found a home, and I would learn to love it. He made an impression on me that day, and I will never forget it. I made it through basic training, and then went for additional training at Tigerland, which was at Fort Polk, Louisiana. This was part of advanced infantry training. This was the last step in training U.S. soldiers to prepare for jungle warfare in Vietnam. There was no doubt that I was going to Vietnam, but I was not overly concerned. I still thought of myself as a misfit, who nobody would miss if I did not return from Vietnam. One thing did surprise me when I was at Fort Polk. I received a letter from my old landlord. I am not sure how he got my address, but he did and wrote me a letter. I was surprised because I had never received a letter before. I made sure that I was alone before I opened it. He wrote the usual banter about the weather in town, success of the local high school sports teams, etc. But he then told me how one night Paula came by the apartment to see me. It was probably 2 weeks after I shipped out, and I had not seen Paula for probably 2 weeks before that. She had not seen me, or made any attempt to see me, for at least a month. Paula was knocking on the door of the apartment when he walked out and asked what she wanted. She told him she was actually my girlfriend and was looking for me. He answered by saying he understood we had broken up because she was dating another guy. He also noted I had seen them go into a hotel together and later holding hands at a local theater. He noted that he took malicious pleasure in telling her this and seeing her mouth drop. He then told her I had left. He had no additional information and did not expect to hear from me again. She was very upset and told him that she never thought our relationship would end this way. He offered to take her home, but she declined. She asked if he ever heard from me, to please ask that I contact her. He told her it was doubtful that I would ever contact him. He did write to me and asked if I should give her my contact information. I wrote back, thanked him for his time, wished him the best, but asked him not to give Paula any information about me. I wanted to forget that part of my life and move on. I got to Vietnam in 1969 and was assigned to the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division. During my time in Vietnam, I participated in a series of bloody firefights, ambushes, and battles. I think that I did well, and was awarded a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart for wounds in combat. I also served in the Cambodian incursion in April 1970, along with several other engagements. I was named as a squad later at the end of my tour. It is actually pretty shocking when you consider that I was 19 years old and had responsibility for the lives of up to 12 men at one time. I will never forget my time in Vietnam and the men I served with. Many of them were killed or wounded. Their service and dedication should never be forgotten. I continued to do well in the Army and had already decided that I was going to stay in the Army and try to do 20 years and earn my retirement. When my tour ended, I briefly returned to the United States and was then assigned overseas to Okinawa. This overseas assignment was appreciated due to the way I was treated when I returned from Vietnam to the United States. Nobody ever spat in my face, but I definitely was treated in a hostile manner by many people in my own country. Okinawa was different also, in regard to how we were treated by the locals. The working girls and local business owners loved us, of course, but the rest of the population was friendly and respectful, but perhaps a little standoffish. The US military unfortunately had a bit of a reputation for being disrespectful and causing problems after drinking too much. I should note that causing problems was not my behavior, but I definitely liked to have a few cold ones. That being said, I must readily admit that I regularly visited some of the flesh pots in Okinawa. I also had no trouble spending money on wine, women, and song. One night I met a dancer named Yoko, and to me she was a real looker. The first thing that caught my attention was that she was very well endowed, which was different from just about all of the ladies I had met in Okinawa. I am stereotyping, but most of the Asian women I met had soft, gentle, and innocent-looking faces. Yoko was very attractive, but did have what I called a hard and sharp look. I found her beautiful, and there was something about her toughness that captivated me. When she danced, everybody checked her out. She had a very nice figure, and looked as if she knew how to use her body. I talked to her on a break, bought her a drink, and we seemed to hit it off. She had no pretensions, and told me that for a certain price, she would entertain me for the night after she got off work. I was thinking with a specific part of my body at that moment, and readily agreed. We then had to negotiate her fee, since I wanted her with me for the entire night, and she seemed happy with this arrangement. Let me say that the night was incredible. She might have been acting, but I can assure you that I was not. I could not get enough of her, and did not want that night to end. The next morning she told me goodbye and had to get home to take care of her young daughter. She spoke good English and told me that she knew people looked down on her because of what she did to earn enough money to take care of herself and her daughter. Her daughter was mixed race of Asian and Caucasian. As a result, she was looked down upon by the people in town. She did not care, though, since she told me her daughter came first, and she would do whatever she needed to do. She had given birth to her daughter when she was 15 years old, and had been basically sold into slavery by her family when she was 12. This put a lump in my throat, because I actually had a lot of respect for her commitment to her daughter, and her survivor mentality. I could relate to what she was telling me, and it accentuated my feelings for her. I then made a second date with her for another night, and that night was amazing also. Some Reddit commenters will say I was a chump, and maybe I was. However, I fell in love with Yoko during that first night, and the second night was even better. The morning after the second night, I asked her to marry me, and she looked at me in an incredulous manner. I reiterated that I loved her and would give her and her daughter a good life. She then agreed to become my wife after having known me for basically 2 days. We were the same age, but I think her life had been much harder than mine. There is no question she accepted my proposal because she wanted to escape her life and create a future for her daughter. I accepted that and promised her that I would earn her love and respect. I told her that we would have a good life together, and a good life together we had. After filling out numerous army forms and fighting bureaucracy, I was able to marry Yoko and eventually adopt her daughter. Her daughter was an absolute sweetheart, and her name was Sakura, which means cherry blossom. Yoko and Sakura had no family before I came on the scene, and we now became a tight family unit. Through hard work, dedication, patience, and commitment, I earned Yoko's respect, and eventually her love. Yoko was completely dedicated to me and her daughter. I think because of her background, she was very protective of her family, and cherished being a wife and mother. One thing that really went well was our time between the sheets. Yoko had no qualms with good loving. She made it clear that as her husband, I would have to give her satisfaction. I had no problem with this, and we had many a hot and sultry night. These amorous activities resulted in 4 more daughters over the next 6 years, and I could not have been happier. My family was doing well, and my army career was going great also. I had been promoted several times and now held the rank of E6. I would not get rich, but the Army took care of my family, and we had no regrets. We also were stationed in West Germany, where I was promoted to E7 and to E8. Having an assignment in Europe was incredible, as we were able to see and do many things that many people never have the opportunity to do. I also finished my education after many years of part-time study and earned a bachelor's degree. My wife Yoko was doing very well, but basically wanted to stay at home, be a housewife, and take care of our family. She did have hobbies including fitness, cycling, ceramics, art, and gardening. This is ironic when you consider what she did before, but I had no complaints. I still have to laugh though. She had a real appetite for what I called our nighttime amorous activities, and the years had not resulted in decline. In fact, she was perhaps even more eager. I was more than happy to oblige, and our private life was more than strong. She was appreciative of the fact that I had kept myself in very good condition and was always ready to take part in what I called the nighttime dance. All of my daughters were very beautiful girls. They were smart, athletic, forward-thinking, and were positioned to do well in life. I was outnumbered at home with my wife and 5 daughters. Things could not have gone better for me, and I was ecstatic to have the family that I always dreamed of. My career had gone well. I also had been at the invasions of Grenada and Panama. Throw in a variety of other difficult assignments, and I can say that I earned my money and served my country. In 1989, I was promoted to E9 as a sergeant major, and I thought I was coming to the end of my career in the Army. Yoko and I had talked about our future, and our plan was to retire to California and open a small bed and breakfast with a restaurant. We also had been stationed in Northern California and really liked the state. The restaurant would also have a small bar with a focus on wines coming from Northern California. It was our dream, and by working together, we knew that this could become reality. Our daughters, for the most part, were pretty much on their own, or in college for most of the year. Our youngest daughter was actually about 15, but smart and very independent. Yoko and I were basically empty nesters, except for our youngest daughter, and things continued to go well. Things were to change, though, due to matters outside of our control. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and I knew immediately that I would once again have to go into harm's way. I was in the Middle East for both Desert Shield and Desert Storm. I came back from what I saw as my final deployment in April of 1991 and submitted my paperwork to retire from the Army in 1995 with 26 years of service. Yoko and I were ready to move on to the next stage of our lives. I had only been retired from the Army for about 6 months when my world fell apart. It was a Friday night when Yoko left to go to the grocery store and told me she would not be long. I began to worry an hour later when she was not back. Please note this was in 1995 and we did not have mobile phones then, so I had no way to contact her. A short time later, there was a knock at my door, and the local police were there. I then learned that my wife had been killed in a car accident when her car was rear-ended by a truck at a red light. I did not think it was possible to feel such pain and devastation as I did on that night. There is no question in my mind that I would have followed her into the next world, if not for my daughters and my now existing grandchildren. All of my daughters arrived at our home within the next 2 days. To make it even sadder, Yoko and I had recently bought a home in Northern California, and we still had boxes to unpack. I had no idea what to do, and could only just sit there and look despondently into a bowl of soup one of my daughters had put in front of me. It was a tough week as we prepared for the services and the burial. I told my wife Yoko goodbye in my mind during the service, but I also knew that someday we would be together once again. My daughters and grandchildren gave me strength. I decided that I would not give up on our dream of a small bed and breakfast with a restaurant. Not only would I open that restaurant, but it would have that small bar in it, with a focus on wines coming from Northern California. It was our dream, and I knew that I would continue to work on it and make it a reality. So, that is exactly what I did. Yoko and I had already bought the land and house. The house was old and large, but was also in very poor condition. We had planned to change it from an old beat-up home into a bed and breakfast open for business. I did all of the renovations on the house and got ready to open the bed and breakfast. When complete, it had 6 bedrooms, individual bathrooms, beautiful gardens, and was very spacious and comfortable. My daughters helped me decorate it and made the selections on paint and furniture. I did the work with the help of 2 of my sons-in-law, and I was very proud of our work. The restaurant project went well also. I did all of the renovation work in a very large barn that had been on the property. Getting work permits and city approvals was a nightmare of a challenge, but eventually we finished the facility. We also had a large room that could handle events such as wedding receptions for up to 180 people. My daughter Sakura managed the restaurant since she had become a chef and always wanted to own her own place. Her dishes were a combination of Asian Californian cool, and business boomed. Our banquet business also went very well since we had little competition in the area. We were known for our food and service. But my life was soon to take another turn as we now fast forward to 2022. My youngest daughter decided to get a take-home DNA testing kit. She turned in the samples, and I did not think much of it. Do not ask me how this works, but apparently other people can see the results online and choose to contact people with similar DNA results. One night, my daughter came running into the house. Her face was ablaze with excitement. She announced that I apparently had 2 brothers, a sister, and a whole extended family in the Chicago suburbs. I'm not sure how she learned about the connections with these people, but apparently we had the same mother, but with different fathers. I made some calls and learned that all of us had been wards of the state. The good news is eventually they were adopted, and their childhoods had generally been happy and secure. They had little memory of life before adoption. My brothers and sister were aware of my existence, but did not know my first or actual last name or where I lived. Nobody knew anything of my actual father, but my mother had apparently died at a young age from either suicide or some type of drug overdose. My older half-siblings had already been removed by the state and placed into foster care at the time of her death. I was removed after the death of my mother. Nobody had any information or background about my grandparents. My mother had apparently originally come from Iowa, and there was no information about that either. My siblings were not able to get any information from the state about me either. I truly had fallen between the cracks because my records apparently could not be located. Well, it is an understatement to say that I was totally shocked to find out that I did indeed have a family. A backyard party was planned at my sister's house in Chicago, and I was asked to attend with my daughters and grandchildren. I happily agreed, and we made the trip to meet the family that I never knew existed. I was now in my early 70s, but was still in very good shape, and I am proud to say that I am not too rough on the eyes. Many of the women in my area had asked me to go on a date. My daughters were always trying to set me up with the mother or grandmother of a friend or some type of shtick like that. I always said no, because my heart belonged to Yoko, and nothing would change that. We stayed in the Chicago area for a week, and enjoyed meeting everybody. I asked my newly discovered family to consider coming to California for a visit when they had the time. One of my brothers worked for a newspaper, and a friend of his was a reporter. He wrote a human interest story about what had happened and how a long-lost family was finally reunited. It was a heartfelt story, maybe a little corny, but it was essentially correct. There was quite a bit about my life in the article since I was depicted as coming from an Oliver Twist type of background, and that I had been decorated as the heroic retired career Army combat veteran with many years of service. I was never into social media, but my daughters talked me into having a Facebook page. I created the page, and my daughter circulated the article that was written about my family. To my astonishment, I got a note from the wife of my former coach, who had treated me so well. He had passed away several years before, but had always told his wife that he would have liked to know what happened to me. When I heard that, I felt like somewhat of a jerk since I did make any effort to find them, or let them know how my life had gone. I had no idea how powerful social media could be in reaching out to people and discovering the ones we have loved and lost. I also received another message from the one and only Paula. She wanted to see me the next time I was in Chicago. I agreed more out of curiosity than anything. I had not seen her in over 50 years, and wanted to see if she looked like her photo. I must admit that she still looked very attractive from her photo. The next time I was in Chicago to visit family, we scheduled a date, and I met her at a nice upscale restaurant. Her life story was interesting. She had been married 5 times, and all of the marriages had failed due to mutual infidelity. She had several children. I was not able to follow the whole story, but one time she apparently had gotten pregnant by a man who was not her husband. She then divorced her husband to marry the father of the child. However, she then apparently got bored and cheated on that man also. My head was spinning when she told me this long and confusing story. She then claimed that I was the only man she ever loved, and she let me get away. Her explanation was that her family had put a lot of pressure on her to break up with me since they saw me as an orphan with poor prospects. I did not comment back on that, but did not buy her explanation. I had seen her walk into that hotel with that guy many years ago. She was eager to go inside with him and participate in the amorous activities that then must have taken place. A chump I was not. All I could think about during the dinner was that I had absolutely dodged a bullet when I saw her go into that hotel with her new paramour. I admit, though, that it was an enjoyable night, and I was glad to reconnect with her after so many years. She asked me if I wanted to see her again, and I told her that I would be pleased to take her out for dinner in California if she ever gets out that way. Paula told me she rarely travels and would never leave Chicago since her children and grandchildren were there. I did tell her that I would be pleased to take her out to dinner again the next time I was in Chicago. I have not heard from her since I got back home, but to be honest, it is not a big deal to me. Maybe I will look her up the next time I'm in town. So we concluded that night with a kiss on the cheek and a hug. I could tell she was thinking about what if, but I am happy to note that I had no thoughts along those lines at all. I had been blessed with a wonderful wife, family, and life. I would not have changed that for anything. It amazed me when I thought that the lowest point of my life then led to the highest. My only regret was that Yoko and I did not get to grow old together. She was a wonderful woman, loyal wife, loving mother, and a great partner. That night when I went to sleep, I thought of Yoko and knew that I was indeed entering the twilight of my life. Soon we would be together once again, and I looked forward to that reunion when we would be together in the next place. Remember